Good evening, everyone. My name's Martin Valley and I work with Cheshire Wildlife Trust. Welcome to our event this evening, where we're going to find know a lot more about beavers by the end of the evening. As you can see, I have moved my location this evening to into the future to our beaver relocation site in a couple of years' time, when it's massive big dams and amazing habitat behind us. So I hope that the dam doesn't burst this evening before the end of the show. For those of you who are interested, this webinar has been recorded, so you can listen to it again later on. We can't see you or hear you, so if you're sitting there in your pajamas eating your dinner, that's absolutely fine. And as you'll know, maybe some of you, that we are currently looking to reintroduce beavers into Cheshire, and this event is part of that endeavour, and we're undergoing a fundraising campaign to see if we can raise the funds to bring it back, and we'll tell you more about that later on. And as part of that, we want to share with you some information about tonight's guest. We've got Ben Goldfarb. He's joining us from the other side of the really big pond. So good afternoon, Ben, because I think it's probably afternoon with you, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's noon here. So thank you so much for having me.
So that's great, Ben. So for those of you who don't know, Ben has written this book here, which I suggest you all go out and buy immediately if you haven't already bought it, which is a really interesting, I've called it a travelogue, a beaver travelogue. It's not a book that I've ever seen before, but Ben's written that, and there's some amazing information there about beavers in America and about beavers in the UK, and he's going to share that with us later on. But before we begin, Ben, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in beavers in the first place.
Sure. I'm an environmental journalist, so I read about nature, wildlife, conservation. I grew up hiking and camping and fishing, so I was always around beavers. Beavers in North America are certainly not nearly as common as they were 500 years ago, but they are much more common than they are in the UK. So I grew up in the presence of beavers and always had some kind of baseline appreciation for them. But maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I went to a beaver conference near Seattle, where one sort of scientist after another kind of came up and gave their pitch about why beavers were so important for creating salmon habitat, for creating refuges against wildfire, for helping us mitigate drought, which is a big problem here in the American West. So, it was then in 2015 or so that I began to realize that, beavers aren't just this fun, neat rodent. They're actually, one of the world's most consequential ecological architects, and can really help us solve a lot of the environmental problems that we face.
Great. That sounds like an epiphany moment there for you. And then you went off and wrote this book. And what was the inspiration for doing that then? Was that like a journey of discovery for you as well?
Yeah, it's there's an amazing kind of beaver movement happening really on both sides of our very large pond, as you put it, Martin. And here in the American West, there are lots of beaver relocation and reintroduction projects happening for all sorts of different reasons, and they're really happening in parallel to this incredible beaver movement that's going on in Britain as well. So that's what I was hoping to explore in this book, is this incredible, really global coalition of beaver believers, as they call themselves, who are working on behalf of this animal.
Well, that sounds great, Ben, and it's great that you've got that perspective from both the American side and the English side. So in a minute or so, we'll let Ben get started. He's going to share some of his experiences and hopefully tell us a little bit more about what we can expect from our beaver site in the future, and how the event is going to run. Ben's going to talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and then after that there will be chance for you to ask questions about anything that Ben's talked about, or about beavers in the UK, or anything about beavers. And the way you can do that is, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see there is a question and answers tab at the bottom there, and if you just click on that, it will allow you to just type a question that you want to answer, and we will collect those questions at the end, and we will answer as many of those as we can. And if not, me and Ben will have to just talk about beavers for 20 minutes, which won't be the worst thing in the world, will it? So, all right, Ben, without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you get on with the show.
Okay, fantastic. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, well, thank you again so much for that introduction, Martin. And thanks to everybody who's on the Zoom call for joining. Tonight, I'll be talking about beavers on both sides of the pond, right? There are two species of beavers in the world. There's the North American beaver, castor fiber. That's what you're looking at here. Those are the beavers that we have. And then there's, we're Castor canadensis, rather. There's the North American beaver. And then there's castor fiber, the Eurasian beaver, which is distributed throughout Europe and Asia. So they're in the same genus. They're very closely related species. They don't interbreed at all, but they affect the landscape in the same way. So, I'll be talking about beavers writ large, and I'm really referring to both of our species, the North American and the Eurasian. So first, before I sort of get into how beavers change the land, I think it's important to establish a few baseline facts. What is a beaver anyway? Of course, it's a rodent. The North American beaver is it's North America's largest rodent. The world's largest rodent is the capybara in South America, but they can get to 50 or 60 pounds. So they're really pretty hefty animals, I think, larger than most people realize. They've got extraordinarily dense fur, as many individual hairs on a kind of a postage stamp size patch of skin as we have on our entire heads. So remarkably dense fur, of course, to stay warm underwater, because they are semi-aquatic rodents that spend most of their lives in and around water. They've got these wonderful webbed duck-like hind feet. So they're very agile, powerful swimmers. They can stay underwater for up to 15 minutes. So fantastic breath holders. They've got these wonderful kind of second set of transparent eyelids called nictitating membranes that basically function as goggles underwater. I think that's a pretty cool adaptation. They also have a second set of lips, kind of like a valve that they can close behind their front teeth, so they can chew and drag branches underwater without drowning. I think that's a really amazing and ingenious adaptation. And then, of course, the feature that makes a beaver recognizably a beaver, the most iconic feature, is its tail. It has this wonderful kind of sort of scaly paddle-like tail. They smack their tails on the water to warn other beavers about predators. So the tail is an alarm system. It's actually a fat storage device. They put on fat for the winters in their tails. And it's also a rudder while they swim. So the tail has all kinds of useful functions. And then the other wonderful beaver feature, of course, is their teeth. Beavers have, these kind of very powerful incisors. You can see that the top and bottom incisors are both orange, and that's because beavers actually fortify their teeth with iron that they derive from their food. And you can sort of see in that picture that the top and bottom incisors basically move together and file each other down into these very nice chisel-like points. Which of course is important when you spend your whole life cutting down trees. So beavers are what scientists call choosy generalists, which means that they eat most species of deciduous tree. But they've got a few species that they really prefer. Anything in the poplar family or the willow family are sort of considered preferred beaver food trees. And they also eat all kinds of green herbaceous vegetation as well. Water lilies and cattails. I've seen them basically mow people's lawns for them. They graze quite happily. And when they eat a tree, they're not eating the heartwood, obviously, they're eating the cambium, which is kind of the inner layer of bark. So they're basically peeling that tree, like you would, corn on the cob or something. Now, one very common misapprehension about beavers that I think might be more common in Britain than North America, unfortunately, is that beavers eat fish. And that, I think that really comes from the Chronicles of Narnia. In Narnia, what's going on? Why isn't this working? There we go. In Narnia, as you may recall from your school child days, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver are pescatarians, and there's this description of Mr. Beaver sticking his paw into a hole and pulling out a trout. And of course, that's not at all accurate. There's, C.S. Lewis sort of misled us all. There's no biological basis to that whatsoever. Beavers are totally herbivorous. So C.S. Lewis, a wonderful fantasy writer, but not much of a biologist. Unfortunately, when I came to England last year and pointed this out in a talk, the Daily Mail kind of raked me over the coals for being an outsider showing up to criticize this beloved British literary icon. So that was how I knew I'd really made it in the UK. It was I was being attacked by one of the notorious British tabloids. So of course, in addition to eating the cambium, the inner bark, beavers also use the wood as construction material. And there are two basic types of beaver structures. There's the lodge, which is kind of the fundamental beaver housing unit. So in that lodge, you've got, two to as many as 8 or so beavers. They're very family-oriented animals. So typical beaver colony, you've got, the male and female who generally mate for life. You've got the newborn kits or baby beavers born in the spring, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds. So you've got kind of 3 year classes of offspring all cohabitating in the lodge. So they're they're very cooperative breeders. So in addition to the lodge, of course, you've got the other kind of classic beaver structure, which is the dam. So why do beavers build dams? What's the point of this very unique, specialized behavior that has no real analogy elsewhere in the animal kingdom? Why do they do this? Well, beavers are on land kind of these fat, slow, smelly meat packages, right? And here in North America, we've got bears and wolves and coyotes and bobcats and cougars, some of which, of course, were would have been native to the British Isles as well. So beavers, are kind of this delicious, delectable piece of meat for any large-toothed carnivore. So by building that dam and creating that pond, beavers are basically enlarging the extent of their shelter. So instead of having to, walk overland to that willow tree and risk getting eaten along the way, they can build a dam and sort of spread water out and swim up to it instead, and then float it back down to the lodge in their pond. And this is what happens to a beaver that spends too much time on land. This is a beaver in Minnesota that got eaten by a wolf. And wolves actually eat the entirety of the beaver, bones, pelt, and all, and just leave behind the mandible and the lower incisors. So yeah, you don't want to be a beaver who meets a wolf on land. So beaver dams come in a kind of an amazing variety of shapes and sizes. A typical beaver colony or family is building one big primary dam, and then a number of smaller secondary dams, and you can have 15 or 20 dams at a single site. So here's a very small dam, probably 3 feet wide and 1 foot tall, that you could jump across in a single bound. And they do get quite a bit bigger. Here's another dam again in Minnesota that is probably 15 feet tall and maybe 600 or 700 feet long, and is obviously the work of many generations of beavers, all adding their stick to the pile. And that single dam is impounding just an incredible volume of water. Here's probably several hundred hectares that are being flooded by that single strategically placed dam. So they can really accomplish an incredible amount with a single dam in the right spot. So the other really important thing that beavers do, which I think doesn't get enough credit, is that they're also amazing canal diggers. They excavate these incredible canal networks that can extend hundreds of feet deep into the forest. And again, the point of those is basically, they can swim up the canal, cut down a tree, and then float the tree back down the canal to the pond, all without getting out of the water. And those canals, I think, are really important in moving water around the landscape and kind of hydrating these valleys. And here's what it kind of looks like when it all comes together. This is a dam complex in Colorado. This is at about 12,000 feet in elevation, so they're really way up in the mountains. And what you can see here is that the stream just kind of meanders along, and then it meets these linear features here, these beaver dams, and spreads out. And in the canal, you can kind of see some of the canals basically moving water around. So without those dams, that water would just shoot straight through this valley. But instead, thanks to beavers, there's just an incredible volume of water being held and created essentially in this little depression in the landscape. So of course, beavers, by building dams and creating ponds and digging canals, they're, of course, the point for them is to engineer their own habitat. But in the process, they're engineering habitat for lots of other creatures as well, especially in North America. But this is really true in Europe as well. We're a very dry landscape in many places, and any animal that's capable of creating water essentially is pretty valuable. Beavers are what scientists call keystone species. So in architecture, a keystone is the top block in a stone arch. And if you pull that block, the whole arch crumbles. And beavers, likewise, are sort of disproportionately important in many aquatic ecosystems. So the list of species that lives in and around beaver ponds is just endless. But a few great examples from North America: great blue herons. This is a great blue heron rookery that I found in Wisconsin at a beaver pond. So you've got a half dozen herons all nesting in this single spot. Moose. This is a moose in the state of Utah living in a beaver pond. And again, moose are these giant aquatic, they're semi-aquatic mammals that were historically native in the British Isles and love to live in and around beaver ponds. And here's I think an amazing example. This is a giant beaver lodge, again in Minnesota. And here what you can sort of see is the beaver dam historically was over here, and then the dam breached. The beavers left the area, the pond drained. So this whole meadow is basically the bottom of a former beaver pond. And when that pond went dry, wolves, a family of wolves, actually moved into the old beaver lodge, and the wolf pack raised their pups inside that beaver lodge. So there's beavers creating habitat for their direct predator. I think that's really incredible. And then, the other fabulous beaver beneficiary are salmonids, the trout and salmon family. This is a juvenile rainbow trout, which is endangered in parts of North America. And you just think, if you're a little baby fish, the length of a finger, you don't want to live in the main stem rushing river. You're just going to get blown downstream, right? You want to live in a pool or a side channel or an eddy or a backwater. And that's the kind of complex refuge habitat that beavers create. So beavers are really incredible for salmon production. Of course, the objection that you hear, and I've heard this in England and Scotland, absolutely, and you still hear some of this in North America as well, is that wait a second, these are migratory fish that have to travel long distances, and why would we want to put more dams into the stream for them to have to overcome? But of course, beaver dams are nothing like human-built concrete dams. Fish can go, they can go around them, they can wriggle through them at times, they can jump over beaver dams. I think this is a cool picture. This is a stream near the city of Seattle, and here's the beaver dam. You can see, and then upstream of the beaver dam are two freshly dug salmon nests, or redds, or as they call them. So at least for a couple of salmon in this stream, that beaver dam was no obstacle whatsoever. And in fact, the evolutionary connection between beavers and salmon is so deep that it inspired my favorite saying, which is that beavers taught salmon to jump, right? I think that gets at the connection really nicely. So historically, beavers were once really, I mean, not just abundant, but ubiquitous in North America and Britain. I don't quite know what British beaver populations were historically, but in North America, we had as many as 400 million beavers on the continent. Today, we're at maybe 10 or 15 million. So we've got a lot of them, but again, a very small fraction of what they would have been historically. And there's a really wonderful book called Beavers in Britain's Past by an archaeologist named Brian E. Coles, where she basically goes through some of the connections between beavers and humans in the British Isles. But I mean, humans learned how to coppice trees from watching beavers. They used beaver dams as travel corridors through marshlands. They used beaver ponds as fish impoundments. The cultural connection is so ingrained that that Cole speculates the Loch Ness monster might have been a family of beavers seen by twilight. So this was an animal that was just so deeply ingrained in both British and North American landscapes historically. But in the UK, beavers have really been absent for several hundred years now, and the primary thing that beavers were killed for in really all of Europe was not their fur or their meat, but it was really for their castor sacs, which is this kind of the scent gland that beavers have, which they use to mark their territories, and those castor sacs were considered to have medicinal properties. And they were used as a panacea to treat everything from epilepsy to diarrhea to headaches, and were incredibly valuable. And beavers were basically wiped out by castoreum hunters pursuing this chemical that beavers basically produce, or this substance that beavers produce in their castor sacs. So, by the 17th century or so, the beaver trade, crosses the pond, and the first fur trappers and traders, arrive in North America, really the early 1600s. And by now, the market has really shifted from castoreum to pelts, because beaver pelts make these wonderful hats, these kind of Victorian top hats that come in lots of different styles that in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century were kind of all the rage. And it's really hard to overstate kind of the cultural and historical significance of the beaver trade in North America. And in Europe as well, certainly. Beavers, along with timber and cod, were really the most important resource that European explorers found in North America. Beavers had a hand in the Revolutionary War. It was sort of the British denial of access to trapping grounds west of the Appalachian Mountains that kind of angered the colonists and helped incite them to rebel. So beavers had a hand in basically every significant post-colonial event in North American history. It was it was beaver trappers and traders of European descent who spread smallpox and other diseases that nearly wiped out many Native American tribes. I think this is kind of a cool and very indicative image. This is a beaver coin, which was minted by the Oregon Territory in 1849, and basically the value of one beaver coin was worth one beaver pelt. So the entire currency operated on the pelt standard. Beaver pelts undergirded the entire Oregon Territory's economy. I think that's pretty remarkable. So of course, the beaver trade wasn't just this enormously consequential historical event. It was also a hugely important environmental event, right? I mean, when you kill, several hundred million beavers, several hundred million beaver dams break down, and the ponds behind them drain to the ocean and are lost. And I think in North America, and this is all, everything I'm saying is of course true in Europe as well. We don't really think about beaver trapping as being, one of the kind of the definitive environmental disasters in our early history, but there's no question it was. This animal is a boreal toad. This is a toad that lives in the American West that breeds almost exclusively in beaver ponds. So what did it mean for the boreal toad that they lost, basically the entirety of their beaver-created habitat? surely that would have been a catastrophe. And again, there were many species, like Atlantic salmon, like moose, all kinds of waterfowl, aquatic insects, other amphibians that would have been similarly impacted in Europe. So fortunately, by the early 1900s or so, society starts to kind of wise up, at least in North America. And Enos Mills, who is a kind of a mentee of John Muir's, posited that a live beaver was more valuable than a dead one, and that was kind of a heretical notion at the time. But slowly, all of these kind of government agencies around North America begin to recognize that, hey, beavers are pretty valuable, and to reintroduce them to places where they'd been trapped out. And beavers were basically extirpated in the United States. So most of the beavers that were being reintroduced were coming from Canada. That was where most of the surviving beavers in North America had been relegated to. And here's I'll just show you this quick video clip. This is from one of the early beaver reintroduction projects in the state of Idaho. And they're basically trying to return beavers to this kind of wilderness area. And this is occurring in 1948. So it's just sort of post World War II. And there are all of these surplus airplanes and parachutes lying around. So after moving the beavers on horseback had failed, some of the biologists in Idaho decided to airdrop a few of these beavers into the backcountry. And they actually, in 1948, they dropped 76 beavers, I believe, into Idaho via parachute. 75 of the beavers survived. One beaver, unfortunately, escaped from his crate in midair and fell to his death. Very, very sad. But the next year, when they flew back over this same area, they saw ponds and wetlands in all of the places where they had dropped beavers. So this was actually a pretty successful project, as crazy as it sounds. And you can watch the entire 12-minute long version of this video on YouTube if you search for the future on YouTube. You'll find the unedited version of that. So, in Europe, again, the situation was really much the same. So in North America, we got down to about 100,000 beavers or so. So, not very many, certainly a lot fewer than 400 million. But in Europe, the situation was even more dire. Europe was down to about 1,000 beavers, in a few isolated populations around the continent. And as you can see from this map, beavers have really made quite an impressive recovery over the last century, thanks to some really wonderful, innovative reintroduction efforts. And this map is actually a little bit outdated, because there are currently beavers in Italy now, which is really wonderful news, which they're not on this map. So the kind of the re-beavering of Europe and Asia is happening at a pretty rapid pace. And beavers have been reintroduced to Mongolia, which of course you can't see on this map. So now there are several million beavers in Europe. So quite a lot of progress from the 1,000 or so that were surviving in 1900. But of course, as beavers return to our landscapes, they have discovered that in their absence, we've kind of colonized all of the good habitat areas, right? It turns out that beaver habitat and human habitat is pretty much the same habitat. We both like these low gradient streams and kind of fertile river valleys. That's where beavers historically built their pond complexes, and that's where we put our farms and our towns and our rail lines and our roads. So as beavers have returned to this very human populated landscape, conflicts have inevitably arisen. I would argue that we're really the nuisance species more so than they are, but there's no question they can be kind of challenging to live with. Here's a set of railroad tracks in Massachusetts that cost about $1 million to refurbish. And within a month of these tracks completion, beavers had them underwater. So, beavers can, they create all kinds of interesting problems. Here's a house that I visited in New Mexico. And what you can sort of see in this picture is that beavers built their dam up to the base of the house. Then they incorporated the house in the dam. and they kind of continued on the other side. So they managed to flood the entire property. So I wouldn't want to be this homeowner, but you have to kind of admire the ingenuity of the beavers in this instance. Another very common beaver conflict is that they like to build in road culverts, which results in the kind of the water level rising and the road getting flooded. That's probably the most common beaver issue that we have in North America. And occasionally they get a little bit more creative. Here's a beaver that broke into a dollar store and was browsing the plastic Christmas tree rack when it was apprehended by the authorities. So beavers cause all kinds of interesting problems. So the way that these conflicts tend to get handled is by killing the beaver that are causing the problems. In the U.S. we kill certainly many tens and probably hundreds of thousands of beavers every year for various conflicts. Of course, as many of you I'm sure know, farmers in Scotland have shot dozens of beavers over the last couple of years after beavers were reintroduced on the Tay River. So there's lots of lethal control happening of beavers, and of course the problem with that is really twofold. I mean, first, when you kill the beavers, you're also killing that wonderful beaver created habitat that we know is so important. But also, all you're doing is putting up a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers, right? As long as the habitat is there, beavers, they reproduce very readily, they disperse very widely, they're always going to find their way back, and you're going to end up dealing with that conflict over and over and over again. So, a lot of what I read about in the book is the need for kind of more ecologically sensible, non-lethal beaver coexistence measures. So I think this is kind of a cool example. This is a reservoir that I visited in the state of Colorado, and here, the wildlife trust that manages this property, they didn't want beavers to cut down their cottonwood trees. They have these beautiful old cottonwood trees, so they wrapped the cottonwood trees in this very low cost wire fencing, and then they left unfenced the non-native Siberian elm trees. So they fenced the native trees they wanted to protect, and then they left unprotected the non-native trees, and the beavers took care of them. So that's actually invasive species control, invasive vegetation control, using beavers as your agent. I think that's a pretty cool example. So I don't think that any beaver should ever be killed for cutting down trees. I just think that's too easy a problem to solve, and yet many thousands are. When the issue is flooding, that can be a more challenging problem to solve. But there too, we've got options. This is a contraption called a flow device. This model is called a Beaver Deceiver, and it's basically a pipe and fence system. You run the pipe through the beaver dam or through the road culvert. The fences are there to kind of protect the pipe ends. The beavers don't plug them up. And you're basically, the idea is that you're basically creating a leak, right? You're using the pipe to move water from the upstream side of the dam to the downstream side. So you're lowering the level of the beaver pond until it's at a point where both the humans and the beavers feel comfortable. There's still enough water there for the beavers to live, but they're no longer flooding your driveway or what have you. And I know that the Devon Wildlife Trust in England has used some of these pretty effectively. So this is the kind of contraption that we can use to solve a lot of beaver conflicts, again, non-lethally, without killing the beavers. And then the other option that we have that that I would love to see become more widely accepted in the UK is relocation, right? Just live trap the beaver in the place that it's causing the problem, and move it to a place where it can survive without causing trouble. And again, in Scotland, I mean, where there's just a huge number of beavers being killed on the Tay River. Meanwhile, there are all of these aspiring beaver projects like the one in Cheshire all over the UK. So I think there's potentially this wonderful beaver source on the Tay side that's not currently being utilized. Those beavers are being killed when they could be live trapped and relocated, which is to me just doesn't make any sense at all. But in the state of Washington in the U.S., there is quite a lot of non-lethal beaver relocation, which is wonderful. This is Sandy and Chomper are these two beavers, being carted off to their new home. And the issue when you relocate beavers, of course, is that if you move a beaver into a new area and it doesn't have its lodge and pond, it's at high risk of being eaten by a cougar mostly. We've got lots of cougars in Washington State. So to kind of prevent that, a lot of these beaver relocation programs that we have will actually build these kind of artificial lodges for the beavers so they can move into a lodge and feel safe. And here's a newly relocated beaver enjoying his human-built lodge. And even at times, you can create an artificial dam and basically form that nice deep pool of water, so that beavers have a pond to move into as well. So here's what's known as a beaver dam analog, or an artificial beaver dam being built to basically prep the ground for beaver relocation. And obviously broken fingers is kind of the big risk there. You got to watch out for that. So I guess to sort of wrap up, I just wanted to talk about a few of the benefits that come with beavers. Why go to so much trouble to bring these animals back? I talked about some of the fish and wildlife species that benefit from beavers, but how do we humans benefit from beavers? Why are these good critters to have around in the landscape with us? Well, they do a few really wonderful things that are just so important here in the 21st century. I mean, the first is that they're storing huge amounts of water, right? By building dams and creating ponds, they're just capturing gigantic volumes of water, and of course, here in the American West, we're in a very drought-prone landscape. But as the climate changes, even the UK is becoming more susceptible to drought, and having these little beaver-created reservoirs becomes more and more important. Here's a really nice illustrative example in the state of Nevada. This is a very kind of degraded, lifeless stream that is basically the result of 100 years of beaver trapping and unmanaged cattle grazing. So in this case, the local cattle ranchers in partnership with the government, sort of just restricted the cattle grazing, let the vegetation regrow, and let the beavers come back. So here's what the stream looked like in 1980, sort of under bad cow grazing and pre-beaver. And here's the next picture, is what it looked like in 2017 after a couple of decades of beaver recovery. So it's just, it's just obviously night and day, and not even remotely comparable. And what the researchers who studied this system found is that, once the beavers showed up, there were 20 more acres of open water. So beavers, again, they're creating these wonderful ponds. Beavers actually added 3 miles to the wetted stream length. So what does that mean? Well, that basically means that before there were beavers, this stream was so degraded that it was going dry before reaching its confluence with the main stem river. But because beavers built their dams and slowed that water down, they basically ensured that the stream would still have water in it, into July, August, September, the hot, dry season. So beavers basically took this degraded seasonal stream and made it a perennial stream. I think that's a really just an incredible example of what beavers can do. Beavers also raised the water table by 2 feet. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at a beaver pond, of course, there's all of this visible surface water. But what you don't see is the weight of that pond forcing water into the soil and rehydrating the ground and recharging aquifers and raising that water table and basically wetting the earth. And beavers do that really effectively. So what that meant in this case was a 100-acre increase in the riparian or streamside plant growth, right? When beavers basically irrigated this whole valley and allowed new plants to grow, which I think is so cool. And that's a big deal for this guy. This is one of the cattle ranchers in the area. His name is James Rogers. And the point that he made to me when I visited him was that beavers had basically increased the grass production on his grazing allotment by tenfold. And of course, that means more weight on his cows and more money in his back pocket. So now, in Nevada, which is historically, most ranchers have been very opposed to beavers. I mean, this guy's own father would shoot the beavers on his ranch whenever he saw them. But now there's this wonderful little pocket of kind of pro-beaver cattle ranchers because they've experienced the benefits that come with having beavers on your land. Another fabulous thing that beavers do is they're really good at capturing pollution, right? Beavers, and here's an old dam again in the state of Colorado. And of course, that dam is slowing the water down and basically allowing all of those suspended pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus, heavy metals, to basically settle out of the water column. So here's this, this nice, beautiful, cake essentially of sediment that beavers have captured in this case. And there have been some wonderful studies in Devon, in England, basically showing this incredible sediment and agricultural pollution capture benefit that you get with even a couple of beavers. This is from this is kind of the University of Exeter, that sort of that river otter beaver trial that you've probably read about. What those guys found was that in that area, a single pair of beavers captured 100 tons of sediment, 15 tons of carbon. So they're sequestering lots of carbon and a ton of nitrogen. So that's, again, a single colony of beavers, of 2 beavers, was capturing 100 tons of sediment. So that's a really valuable function, I think. I mean, they've got all of this topsoil basically running off the landscape under these intensive agricultural regimes, and beavers are basically slowing that process down. And again, likewise, beavers they're kind of incredible flood mitigators as well. This is a beaver dam in Scotland that I visited, and there, I mean, it's very clear that beavers are kind of these incredible flood mitigation agents, right? Beaver dams and ponds are slowing water down. They're spreading water out laterally. They're sinking it into the ground. So there's been some wonderful research again from the University of Exeter, basically showing that 30% of a big stormwater pulse just kind of vanishes when it hits a beaver dam and pond complex. So these really destructive floods that are just racing downstream are being attenuated by beavers in a really major way. And I think it's that flood control benefit that's driving a lot of the enthusiasm around beavers in the UK right now. And then the final, fantastic benefit that's really top of mind right now for us in the U.S. is, their ability to help us fight fires, right? I'm sure that you've all read about the really devastating wildfires that have affected us recently, and beavers, of course, by spreading that water out, by hydrating the landscape, by irrigating plants, are basically creating these wonderful little fire refugia where all of the creatures can kind of retreat to during the fire and then repopulate from there. And here's a kind of an amazing picture in Idaho, and you can see that all of the upland slopes are just burnt to a crisp. And the only, green, wet, lush place in the landscape is this beaver created valley bottom. So the notion that beavers are maybe our most valuable assets as firefighters is increasingly exciting, I think. So given all these wonderful beaver benefits, why aren't beavers more widely accepted yet as restoration tools? Why are we still, sort of fighting this uphill battle on behalf of beavers? Well, I think a lot of it is our historical amnesia. When we destroyed beavers, both in North America and Europe, we destroyed the kinds of landscapes that beavers create, and we internalized degraded aquatic ecosystems as being normal, right? We look at, a kind of a fast, straight, free-flowing, gravel-bottom stream as kind of the perfect, healthy stream, the kind of thing that you would go fly fishing in. When in reality, a lot of our 2 continents looked like this historically, thanks to beavers. They're kind of these big murky swamps with dead and dying trees all over the place. And I think that a lot of people look at these landscapes and think that they're fundamentally unnatural somehow, when in reality this is this would have been historically much more rule than exception. So we have to reconfigure our imaginations, I think, if we're going to fully embrace beavers on the landscape, both in North America and the UK. So to sum it all up, we've got this amazing animal. It does all of these, performs all these incredibly valuable ecosystem services. It creates habitat for other species as well. It does it all for free, and it doesn't need permits. That's the best part. Although I guess you guys need a lot of permits in the UK for relocation. But for us, kind of wonderfully, we just have to stay out of the way and let the rodent do the work, as the mantra of the beaver believers go. And I sincerely hope that thanks to the Cheshire Wildlife Trust and groups like it, you'll be at that point as well in the UK before too long, where the fences come down and some of these these experimental beaver reintroductions can become free-ranging, wide-roaming beavers all over the British Isles. So here's hoping that we all learn to let the rodent do the work. So with that, I'll say thanks very much, and I guess Martin and I will take some questions and maybe talk about beavers.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Ben. That was inspiring, and what I find fascinating about that is the insight it gives us into what we might expect in the future in the UK for beavers. So at the moment, we're at the very beginning of that journey, where we've got a number of reintroduction sites in England, and everybody is sort of saying, what's that going to look like? What can we expect? And there's a little bit of fear about the future, but it's great to see from your perspective that actually there is nothing really to fear from the future with regards to beavers. And actually that last point that you mentioned about what we consider to be a natural stream, I find most interesting, because it will be interesting to see what's the preference in the British public. Would they prefer that landscape without the beaver or the one with the beaver? And how do we adjust people's mindsets to accepting, if you like, the new normal of watery landscapes? How would you help us British people to get used to what landscape might look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, to me, I think I just think there's no substitute for actually visiting a beaver colony. I remember last year when I was in England, I went to see the Cornwall Beaver Project, where a couple of beavers had been reintroduced on Chris Jones's farm, and and there I led a kind of an evening beaver walk with a bunch of people who never seen a beaver before, and it was just this incredibly inspiring experience, because we were out there and there were dragonflies everywhere, bats everywhere, of course the beavers themselves were very, very obliging, all kinds of songbirds. It was just such an obviously impressively biodiverse landscape, and I think it's and I'm not sure this completely answers your question, but I think it would be hard to be in that landscape and not recognize how fundamentally healthy and biodiverse and important it is. So I guess I would just encourage anybody who has doubts about beavers to visit one of the handful of places in the UK where you can see them, and I think it's just unmistakable what a kind of a natural, healthy part of the ecosystem they are.
Great. And it is also interesting how you say they deal with pollution as well, because the Environment Agency in the UK have just released their latest findings on the states of rivers in the UK, and they discovered that no river is free of pollution, and 84% of them don't meet the government's target for good ecological status. So our UK rivers are crying out for beavers, I think is probably what we can say about that. So let's get down to some questions then. Let's start with Wendy. Wendy's got a question which either of us may be able to answer. I think, what's the minimum size of population required to be self-sustaining, or how many families do you need, or how much land is required to support population? Now in America, you don't have that problem. Is that something you're familiar with? That sort of how many beavers do we need here, or do they just?
Yes, It's a good question. I mean, I think that really, I mean, all you need is a couple of pairs generally to to start up populations. I mean, that's been our experience in North America. So 4 beavers, 2 mated pairs, you can get you can go a long way with just a couple of beavers.
Yeah, and I should say in our site in Delamere where we were introducing them, the number of beavers we're going to get keeps changing actually as we find out more about them. But initially we were looking at a pair, and that is a site which is about 10 hectares, and that is deemed to be relatively quite big, or very suitably big, and hopefully they will just spread out from there. So here's an interesting question then from Tom. He says the amount of natural predators to beavers in North America was mentioned. You were saying about how cougars take a lot of them, or wolves. Considering how the majority of these species of large predators are generally now extinct in Britain, do you think that this causes a risk of an unsustainably fast-growing beaver population?
I would say certainly not. It's pretty clear. There's a great study of beaver wolf dynamics in Minnesota. It's called the Voyagers Wolf Project, which is really the Voyagers Wolf and Beaver Project. What they've found there is that predation is not the limiting factor for beaver population growth or extent. What really matters is the available habitat. So I think that in the UK, your experience will very much be, beavers the population will grow to fill the niche that is allowed for it, whether there's natural predation or not. So I don't think that predation is really a limiting factor at all on population growth. I think it's really about the available habitat for them.
And you before the webinar, you were also saying that we might need to get used to beavers in unusual places. So we see them in the UK at the moment as being from distant places far away that we don't get used to. But you say you've seen them in all sorts of urban places like Seattle, for example.
That's right. Yeah, I do think that. I mean, we have that perception too. That right, this is an animal that requires a lot of space and is hard to kind of live cheek to jowl with. But that's just again untrue. It's again in Seattle. I think that 76% of the kind of the available stream habitat is occupied by beavers. One of the largest cities in the country, and it's just kind of brimming with beavers. In the course of writing this book, I went to there's this Walmart, this giant sort of superstore in Utah that and they had a beaver basically build a dam in the parking lot essentially, and they were able to sort of tolerate that without any adverse impacts. So I think there's really no limit to where these animals can be if we're willing to use the kinds of non-lethal measures that I talked about.
So we need to be prepared for a few surprises then, you think, perhaps? The alternative is we could always reintroduce wolves, which is maybe the other way to look at it, and I'm open to any suggestions out there.
Well, I do think that's kind of an interesting notion, is that, I mean, here's this, in some way, maybe beavers are kind of this gateway drug, right? Where, this is sort of the first step in a much larger rewilding. Who knows?
But it is interesting that when you were mentioning moose, and we think of moose as being a North American thing, and it was never in England. But actually, we've forgotten a lot of the things that we've lost, haven't we? We would say moose, they're not native, or elk, they're not native. But actually, a lot of these things were coexisting, weren't they? If you go back 1,000 years ago. So then Joe's asked a couple of questions. The site in Nevada you showed that went from being really brown to being really, really green. Was that a reintroduction, or did the beavers just come? I mean, how many beavers were put in there, and how long did that take to make that transformation?
Yeah, that was, there were actually no beavers reintroduced there. That is kind of another amazing testament to the fact that if the habitat can support them, they will find their way back if they're permitted to. So no beavers were reintroduced; they just kind of magically appeared. Right.
That's the kind of cheap reintroduction that we like. I tell you, we can do with that.
Right, exactly.
So Anna's asked the question that I can probably ask, and that is, what's the status of beaver reintroductions in the UK? So the one that we're looking at now is the 10th enclosed reintroduction. So still in the UK, we're in a situation where the Natural England are slightly nervous about having these wild releases because they're not quite sure what they're going to do. We've got a lot of issues with landowners and people that are in conflict with beavers to resolve. So until those have been resolved, we're still doing what we call these enclosed releases, which are sites anywhere between say 4 and 10 hectares with a family of beavers put in, which allow us to see what they do and how they behave and to monitor any impacts. And if you're interested, the Devon Wildlife Trust have got some really good results from their trial, which has been going on for 5 years, which have sort of unanimously shown that they're a good thing, and the government has now resolved to allow that population to stay. And I hopefully over the next 4 or 5 years we will see these enclosed sites being allowed to just remove the fences and the beavers just to spread out from those points. But at the moment there's only a handful of sites where we're sort of doing these pilots to see what kind of impact the beavers have. So then another question we've got is, do farmers in the US get any compensation for damage caused by the beavers?
Yeah, and generally they don't. There are a couple of projects starting up that basically provide provide technical assistance and some funding to farmers and ranchers who want to install a beaver deceiver or wrap their trees in wire fencing or what have you. So that those kinds of compensation programs are beginning to pop up, but we need more of them. And actually, I mean, Martin, it'd be good to hear about your experience in Bavaria here, because I feel like Bavaria has kind of the best model for this kind of program anywhere in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's a key part of certainly the reintroductions in Europe, is this balance. You've talked about how beavers can cause a problem, and that's got to be recognised. Overall, they're a benefit, but actually there are some disbenefits, and those people that are disadvantaged through that disbenefit system need to be recompensed. So certainly in Bavaria, where I've been, if there's any question of the beavers causing damage to the farmer is automatically getting compensation for that, and that's part of the trust in the system. So Liz asks, we've heard that beavers are fussy in how they will pair, and that one problem with reintroductions is ensuring that the pairs like each other. Is this true? Is this something that you've noticed, that beavers are a bit fussy?
Yeah, it is. I'm not sure that they're fussy, but it is true that certainly that not every pair hits it off right away. And a lot of the beaver reintroduction projects in the U.S., they'll kind of have this. They've got a series of enclosures of little pens basically, and they kind of mix and match the males and females until they find a suitable match. So yeah, that is it can be an issue, but all beavers are pairable eventually. So if you have enough beavers on hand, you'll find a mate for most of them.
It sounds very similar to our human experience, doesn't it? Really, you can't just put a male and a female together and expect them to get on, can you really?
Yeah, exactly. Really the key is it's kind of an interesting challenge, because beavers, they're again these very family-oriented animals. So if you're moving them, of course you want to move the whole family together. But the issue is that a lot of the beavers you catch are going to be kind of these solo beavers, the dispersing kind of teenage 2-year-old beavers who have just left home and are kind of looking for a new place to live, and end up in a farmer's irrigation ditch or something like that and get into trouble. That's a lot of the troublemaking beavers are the teenagers, not surprisingly. So those are the ones you gotta pair up, or those solo adventurous dispersing beavers.
Yeah, beaver matchmakers.
Exactly.
So do we have any human predators? I mean, I think is fur an issue anymore? Is that likely to come back, do you think? Somebody's asked here.
Yeah, there definitely is fur trapping. I mean, certainly most of the beavers that get killed are sort of the conflict-causing beavers, and then the trapper will just kind of sell the fur incidentally to that, because fur prices are very low right now. It's like $12 a pelt or something like that. There is still a market for it, mostly in Russia, China, South Korea. Those are the big kind of pelt markets. But again, prices are low enough that there's not a ton of beaver trapping, but there is some, and that's something that can be an issue. I mean, I've one of the very frustrating things in the U.S., and without getting sort of too deep into the wildlife management weeds, we've this situation where of course we've got kind of the federal government, these federal agencies managing these giant swaths of land, but then you've got the state agencies, which manage the wildlife that lives on the land. So one thing that you see sometimes is a big federal government agency like the U.S. Forest Service, wants to reintroduce beavers to one of their forests to improve the habitat. But then the state agency, like the Wyoming Game and Fish Department or whoever, will permit those beavers to be trapped. So you've got one government agency moving beavers back, and the other agency letting people kill the beavers that are being put back in a place, which is maybe not unlike the situation in Scotland in some ways, where you've got a lot of people shooting a lot of beavers that that other people want to protect. So it's that there are always some interesting wildlife management issues.
Yeah, it's probably worth saying from a UK perspective or a European perspective that beavers are a European protected species, which means that beaver burgers or beaver pelts or beaver hats would be deemed illegal under European law. So that does give them a level of protection in the UK. So I've got an interesting question here about climate conflict. So Carlo's asked, in the world where we're struggling with carbon emissions and we're trying to plant trees, do beavers and their action with trees, does that have any impact? Does that affect the distribution of trees? By reintroducing them, are we creating a problem for ourselves because they'll just eat all the trees that we're trying to solve our climate crisis?
Yeah, it's a good question. And well, of course, I'm a shameless beaver apologist, but I would say, certainly I don't think that's an issue at all. And in fact, well, two things. First, beavers are, yes, they're cutting trees, but they're also amazing irrigators, right? They're spreading water out. They're saturating the soil, so they are stimulating the growth of new trees. And they're almost like rotational farmers, where they'll cut down trees in one area and then irrigate trees in the other area and kind of go from stand to stand over the course of many years. But the other thing from a carbon emission standpoint is that beavers are great carbon sequesterers, right? They're capturing all of this incredibly rich organic matter in their pond complexes. They're basically setting down layer after layer of very carbon-rich sediment, and there have been some wonderful studies in the U.S. basically showing that the volume of carbon sequestered by a family of beavers is equivalent to or even exceeds the same volume of carbon that would be sequestered if that area was a forest. So this notion of blue carbon, of carbon that can be stored in wetlands and estuaries and other sort of watery environments is, I think, of increasing interest to scientists, and beavers are kind of a great agent of blue carbon sequestration.
So you would say they're net carbon contributors then?
That's again, this is an area that requires more study and is being studied, but based on what we know now, they are certainly net carbon sequesterers, not emitters.
Right. Okay. So we've got a cluster of questions about Delamere, and I think I'm going to answer those in a little while. But I've got another question here about Nick has asked how beavers cope on unnaturally flashy rivers. So if you know what a flashy river is, it kind of gets flushed through, and then sometimes it's running fast, and sometimes it's running slowly. Are they able to cope with that with extreme variability in river flow?
Yeah, it's interesting. They, that is what we see. When you sort of look at different parts of the United States, one of the things that we see is that, of course, some places are much flashier than others. And here in the West, we do have, we get big snowpacks most years, and then you get this huge melt. And it is true that that beavers have a harder time maintaining very long-term dams in those places. And it's interesting. Out here in Washington, where I live, a dam that was 5 or 10 years old would be a pretty old dam in a lot of cases. Whereas, in the Midwest, in Wisconsin or Minnesota, where the land is flatter and the streams are less flashy, there are dams that are literally hundreds of years old. So, the flashiness affects their ability to sort of maintain their dams, but it doesn't affect their ability to survive. If you get a big flood, they'll just move down the system. ride the wave and and then come back up when they're ready. So it affects the kind of the stability and long-term maintenance of the dams, but it doesn't affect their ability to actually inhabit the stream and survive.
Okay, well, we're just about running over time here, and just before we finish, I'm just going to do a little bit of an update on our particular project. And whilst I'm trying to get the slide up that I need, you can maybe answer this question to fill the time in, which is, are they difficult to trap? Are beavers difficult to trap, and do you have to tempt them into a trap? How do you go about trapping a beaver?
Yeah, so they're very territorial animals. So usually you trap them by basically putting a little bit of scent lure. So a lure made from the castor sacs of another beaver on the trap, and that then they kind of show up to kind of check out who else has been in the neighborhood, and they get caught. So they're pretty easy animals to trap compared to others.
So we don't need to spend a lot of time trying to get hold of them. Then if for some reason you need to move them on.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so then moving back to our beaver appeal. I'm going to take that off actually. What I will do is I'll leave this up at the end because I can't see the questions. I'll leave that up at the end, and we can leave you with that slide. We're just going to look at people have asked some questions about our particular beaver reintroduction site, and I just want to cover those off just that we're getting for completeness. So we are going to reintroduce a pair into Delamere. And it's going to be in a fenced enclosure. We've had a question here, and I don't know whether you may be able to input into this as well, but there's we're introducing one pair into a small space, and Alison has asked about this sort of inbreeding or the genetic stock of beavers. Now, for us, our beavers are coming from Scotland, but what we're hoping for over the next 5 or 10 years is that as reintroductions happen in the UK, the majority of them will come from populations in Scotland. So they'll all have, I don't know, the same great grandparents. But what we're hoping is that our families will genetically diversify, and then possibly we can mix our families with species from Derbyshire or species from Devon. And so the next generation of reintroductions will try and dilute that gene pool a little bit. Do you have that problem in America with genetics, or is it also there's so many of them it's not a problem anymore?
Yeah, I haven't heard it being an issue, and I think that most rodents in general are sort of not totally resistant to inbreeding, but less susceptible to it than other groups of mammals for whatever reason. So I have not heard of inbreeding being an issue in North America at all. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm just checking if we've got any more questions that we need to answer before we finish up. We've got a lady here who's asked, Delamere is being mainly coniferous, how will the beavers survive? So actually the beavers the site where we're introducing them is not actually we call it Delamere, that's because we imagine that people won't necessarily understand the location within Delamere. So it's on an area next to an existing nature reserve that we've got that does have, it's not conifer, it's got plenty of willows and food that beavers can eat. So we're not going to reintroduce it literally in the forest, which is primarily conifer. But if you ever go into the forest, I was in there yesterday and I was walking around, and everywhere I looked, I kept thinking, look at that amazing beaver habitat in there. It's going to be great. Why isn't there any beavers? So I imagine that if we are at some point in the future able to remove the fencing and the beavers are able to go downstream into Delamere, they could be there 20 years before they come out the other side, because there is so much a good habitat for them. So with regards to that site, Joe has also asked, will the beavers hide away from people, or will they be comfortable with people going to see them through the fence? What's your experience, Ben, of trying to see beavers?
Yeah, I think that, certainly there'll be an initial acclimation period. They are kind of shy, retiring animals. They're crepuscular or even nocturnal. So, if you want to have a chance of seeing them, certainly, dawn and dusk, the closer to dark, the better. But, it's also true that they certainly do habituate. I remember there's this one beaver pond that is in Massachusetts that I like to visit, and there, that beaver lodge has been in place since the 1950s, and people actually stand on top of the lodge to go fishing, and the beavers will come out at dusk and maintain their lodge while people fish off of it 5 feet away. So that's maybe an extreme example, but there's no question that they can habituate to people.
Yeah, our site is not really on the main thoroughfare, so we will be doing trips into the site, but they're going to be sort of organised, so it's not going to be possible for the public to go into the site, and I think that's probably wise given the limited exposure that a lot of people have had to beavers. We're not quite sure how people are going to respond, so you will be able to go and see them, but it will be on sort of organised trips that we'll do, because then we can show people the beavers in the best light. So like you say, there's no real point going in at the midday. You might be disappointed because they'll be asleep. So we make sure that people get the best experience possible. Right, I think that's all the questions that I'm hoping I've got answered all the questions. So thank you everyone for your questions. They've been great to talk through them, and thank you to you, Ben, for sharing your experience of beavers. Next time you're over, we'll definitely have you over to come see our site, and you can share. But I just wanted to add just one last final question about your experience of seeing beavers in America and then seeing them in England. Did you have any sort of reflections on how we are going about it in England? I mean, for some people, the idea of putting them in a fenced enclosure and not letting them run free is sort of really alien. Have you got any sort of reflections on the comparisons between the two countries?
I think it's a good question. I think that seeing beavers in England made me realize how incredibly fortunate we are in North America to have these animals. I remember going out with Chris Jones, this farmer with the Cornwall Beaver Trust, I led this beaver walk, and and for basically everybody there, for all of these Brits, it was their first time seeing a beaver, and it was like seeing the Loch Ness monster. Like, here's this giant rodent with this huge crazy paddle tail that cuts down trees and builds these incredible structures. It's like beavers in North America, because we've lived with them for such a long time, we take them for granted. I think they're almost mundane in some ways, and being around people, experiencing them for the first time. I mean, there were tears in people's eyes, to seeing this crucial lost piece of the fauna returning to their landscape. And it just made me realize how fortunate we are, not only to have beavers, but to have wolves and moose and bison and everything that we do have. And and how exciting it is to so many people in the UK that these animals are coming back now. So for me, seeing beavers in England with people who've never seen them before was just a really special, magical experience, and one that I hope to repeat.
Well, I have to say the response that we've had to our introduction has been phenomenal. We've had children sending in good luck cards to the beavers, and we've had amazing donations. We've had an amazing response to a mail out that we did to get people to engage with it, and it's certainly the most remarkable thing that we've done. And for those of you out there who aren't aware of what we've been doing, it's not too late. So the update on our beaver project is that we've started on the fencing. You can see this picture here shows some of the fencing poles going in. We started the appeal a month ago, and we've had a fantastic response to that. But this is a 5-year project, and we do still need additional funds to keep it going, and also to keep the staff who are going to be going on the site and the events going, and everything around the momentum around this appeal. So if you do want to give to the appeal, it's still possible to do so. And I am told that if you scan your phone over the QR code on this page, then it will take you direct to the donate page. So I am going to leave this slide up a little bit at the end of the talk in case you want to do that, or you can go directly to our webpage and you can do it from there. And it is also worth saying that we're doing these beaver adoption packs now. So if you want to get an adoption pack, perhaps for a friend or for a Christmas present, then they're available as well. And if you're interested in following what's going on with our reintroduction, you can sign up online to get the updates from social media and all of that kind of stuff. So it's not too late to take part in ours and to be part of what we're trying to do here in Cheshire. And it's been amazing talking to you, Ben, to see where we might be in just a few years' time. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in and for your questions. It's been really interesting to communicate with you in that way. So the webinar is going to be over now. I'm going to leave this slide up, but if you want to just leave any time, thank you for joining us, and keep coming back to us to see how we're getting on with this beaver. So good evening, everyone. Good afternoon to you, Ben.
All right, thanks, Martin, and good luck. I can't wait to see how it turns out.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Take care.
There's something wrong with the new water filter.
Why?
The water tastes terrible.